Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live with Mustangs? If so, this episode is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. I hadn't planned to adopt Mustangs. It just happened to me. After I sold my horse boarding facility in 2000, I moved to a house set on 40 acres. It was completely fenced, as the previous owner had owned cattle, with 2 sheds, a corral, no irrigation water, and it's really dry here in Colorado, and the land was a mess from overgrazing, with lots of weeds and dirt. After getting rid of noxious weeds and resting it for a few years, the pastures became full of grass and healthy. I've owned horses since I was 12 years old, but they had always at least had some training, and I boarded them at facilities where they had stalls or sheds and limited turnout. Now, in my own place, my pet sitter Martha, who looked after my dogs when I was away, said, "You should have Mustangs here, and I'll take care of them when you travel." I didn't think much more about that until I was at Equine Affair in Ohio in April 2010. I was speaking about wild horses and horse photography, and I saw a post on Facebook with a photo of 2 young horses at an adoption in northern Wyoming. It was the 2 brothers I called the Cremosso colts. I had known them since they were born in the McCullough Peaks herd in Wyoming in 2007. They had been absolutely inseparable, and I enjoyed spending time with them every time I visited the peaks. Now they looked so scared, standing in the middle of the corral as far away from people as they could get, and no one had adopted them. I was shocked. They were so beautiful. How could no one have adopted them? When I got home, I made some calls and found out they were at the Mantle Ranch in Wyoming. When I asked what would happen to them, Steve told me he'd put them in online adoption. I was horrified. These horses had endured so much, losing their home and their family, with Indigo as the father and band stallion in the roundup I observed in 2009. I could not endure the idea of them being separated from each other. I talked to some friends, and I found a trainer who was willing to work with them to gentle them. We picked them up at the Mantle Ranch, and they stayed with the trainer for several months, and I went to visit and watch him work with them every week. Finally, they came to my home, and making sure that they were easy to catch and halter and have their feet trimmed and load in the trailer were my priorities. I did not plan to ride them, and I had never worked with wild horses before. They are still, and always would be, wild at heart. Claro was the calmer and gentler of the 2. He wasn't really a Cremello, but a pinto with no color. He was the first one I touched, and what a thrill it was. Cremosso was withdrawn and miserable. The roundup and the loss of his family weighed more heavily on him. His mother and her sisters had all doted on him, and now he just had his brother. I could feel the tension in him when I haltered him, and he was much more on alert than Claro. It took some time before he relaxed enough to stop watching the trimmer the whole time she was trimming his hooves. Cremosso would absolutely not have made a good candidate for a riding horse, and so I'm very glad he ended up with me. I learned to move more slowly around them than my past domestic horses. They were more alert, and all I needed to do to get them to back up if they were crowding me was rub my winter jacket. All those things that I took for granted with domestic horses had to be unlearned. I needed to be more intentional and deliberate when I asked them to do something. I kept them in the corral until I could reliably catch and halter them, and when I released them into the big pasture, they felt at home immediately. They would climb the huge hill and graze and look out, run down to the pond and roll, and whenever it was wet, Claro was always covered in mud. Cremosso was more fastidious. When I called them in with sweet feed as a reward, they acted much as any wild horse. They would think about it for a while, and in their own good time, make their way to me. I now had a piece of the wild with me in my home, and it totally changed the way the property felt. I mentioned I had 2 sheds. One's very large, and I divided it to store hay in my lawn tractor and spreader on one side, with the other side for shelter for the horses. There was another smaller shed in the corral, but they did not like to be in the corral, in the shed, in bad weather. Rain or snow or wind, they liked to shelter near the cedar trees on the other side of my driveway. The main time they liked to go in the shed was in the summer when the sun was intense, especially Cremosso with his sensitive green eyes. My dogs are separated from the horses with a tall fence, and they seemed to know that the dogs could not get in, and they enjoy teasing the dogs, coming up close to the fence and remaining completely unfazed by barking. In October 2010, I went to observe the Adobe Town Roundup in Wyoming. I had a friend with me, and at the end of the first day, when we were leaving the observation location, we saw a family of wild horses I had first encountered a month ago. The sorrel stallion with the wide blaze was gorgeous, with a flowing mane and tail, and his gray mare had an adorable Palomino colt. When they moved away after we had spent time with them, my friend Judy told me she wanted to adopt the Palomino colt if he was rounded up. His family was captured the next day. As it turns out, she was not able to adopt him and was heartbroken. So I decided that I would. I was able to go into Canyon City in Colorado to the weanling pen and find him. The weanlings did not behave like the stallions. The stallions ran away if you were anywhere near their enclosures. The weanlings were curious and walked closer to the fence, and Micah was the most curious of all. I had to wait over a month to pick him up because a wild gray stallion we named Liberty had jumped the fence and escaped the day he was brought to the facility. They could not complete the coggins for the horses there until he was captured, and unfortunately he died after being darted with a tranquilizer. He was just too wild to be contained. By the time we were allowed to pick up our adopted horses, strangles had run through the facility, hitting the weanlings the hardest. Luckily, Micah was sick but recovered, unlike some of the other adopted weanlings who passed away. Wild horses have no immunity to the diseases in the holding facilities. The same trainer who had worked with the 2 boys took Micah for a couple of months before he came to my home. I wanted to make sure that they did not gang up on Micah, so they were introduced to him one at a time and spent time with him. But I need not have worried. Both Claro and Cremosso loved Micah immediately, and I remembered that when they were still wild, they were always gentle with the foals in their family. Since Micah had been less than a year old when I got him, he was much easier to train, less afraid, and his personality was so outgoing and curious that learning new things was easy. I took him to a couple of Meet the Mustang events, a class on obstacle courses, and Micah was confident and relaxed and enjoyed meeting new people. When he was 5 years old, I took him to my friend Beth Beamer, who is a wonderful and patient trainer, and she worked with him and trained him under saddle for a year. But by that time, I had stopped riding. So my 3 boys had one job, as ambassadors for wild horses. I've had many journalists out to my place to interview me about wild horses, and the horses love to see and meet new people. And Cremosso would hang back, but he'd warm up gradually. 4 years ago, in the early morning, I found Claro lying down next to the cedars, moaning. I immediately called my vet Dale, moving Micah and Cremosso to the corral, and although he arrived only 30 minutes later, there was nothing to be done other than keep him from suffering further. It was a very severe colic. After he passed, I led Micah and Cremosso over to see his body so that they would know what had happened. Cremosso was so sad. Although Micah was still with him, he would never see the brother he spent all 11 years of his life with again. I worried about him and hoped that he would hang in there and gradually feel better. After the 2020 roundup in the Red Desert Complex of Wyoming, when my friends and I worked so hard to find Blue Zeus and his family and Misun and his family for sanctuaries, I decided that I wanted to adopt Helios, son of Hera and Apollo. Apollo was one of the wildest older stallions in the desert, and I'd become enchanted with the little Cremello Pinto foal that his lead mare Hera foaled in April of that year. He was very close to his mother and a sweet little boy. I contacted Rock Springs with his tag number and asked if he were there, and they told me he had been sent to Canyon City along with the other family members we were trying to locate. I thought that having a youngster around might be just the thing for Cremosso, who was still grieving the loss of his brother, and for me because I was grieving the loss of so many of the magnificent horses in the Red Desert Complex. But getting Helios out of Canyon City proved to be a long, drawn-out nightmare. The BLM facility at the prison was locked down due to COVID, and they didn't want any members of the public there. After so many phone calls and emails and anxious waiting, they finally scheduled an adoption, and only a very small number of people were allowed to go, with ridiculously strict rules since there was a prison there. No phones or cameras. And finally we were allowed in. Hundreds and hundreds of horses, all in muddy pens. After finding, identifying, and getting the tag numbers of Blue Zeus's mares for Claire, I went up to the yearling pen to look for Helios. There he was, very thin. A far cry from the sturdy, healthy 6-month-old I had last seen before the roundup. His tail had been chewed off. Half the horses in this pen were very thin. Clearly, there had not been enough food, and the more assertive colts were getting most of the food. I filled out the paperwork and got a time scheduled in 3 weeks when I would be able to pick him up. It would be 10 months total that he and the other horses had been stuck in that horrible place. They loaded him in my trailer, and I headed to my friend Beth's house. She agreed to gentle Helios for me. He was so scared, so thin, with warts all over his nose. She went very slowly with him, inviting him to work with her, and I went to visit every week of the 3 months he was there. Once he began to trust her, he came along so quickly. And the first time he reached out to touch me and I scratched him was truly bliss. He is such a sweet boy. While he was still at Beth's, I had been working to see if an investigative journalist would do a story on the mistreatment of the horses at Canyon City. They let 2 journalists in, but they would not let them see the Red Desert horses, just the newly captured Sandwash Basin horses. So I invited her to come and interview me and meet Helios. He was unfazed by the big camera and even allowed her to pet and scratch him. A true Mustang ambassador. I brought Helios to my home in December 2021, and he was a good, healthy weight, no more warts, and his demeanor was so much more relaxed and confident. I put him in the corral where he could meet Micah and Cremosso over the fence so they could get to know each other slowly, and I didn't want there to be any injuries or any problems. He would watch them and call out to them when they moved away from the corral. Cremosso looked more interested and happy than I had seen him in years, and I knew I'd done the right thing. When I let Helios into a small pasture with Micah and Cremosso, they all ran around. Micah had to chase him and assert who was boss, but then they settled down to graze together. It took Micah quite a while to let Helios close, but Cremosso immediately found a friend, and I often found him standing over Helios as Helios lay down sleeping in the sun. In January, I heard from Steve Leonard, Colorado Wild Horse and Burro Program Lead and head of the BLM at Canyon City, who said that he personally was going to come out and do an adoption compliance inspection, even though Canyon City was 3.5 hours away from my home. I had never had a compliance inspection before with my previous adoptions of Mustangs, so I really didn't know what to expect. My friends Ginger Catherines and Ginger Fadak came to support me. I found out that they check for the condition of the horse, the hooves, water, drainage, hay, shelter, and fence height. Steve gave Helios a body score of 5, and ironically, when I picked him up from Canyon City, it was about a 3. Helios got lots of scratches from everyone, including Steve. My 3 Mustangs are always together, and they bring me so much joy. I love to see them running in for their hay, playing in the cool early mornings, sleeping in the sun in the afternoons. Although I love them all dearly, I wish that they had been allowed to live out their lives in their homes with their families. That is my wish and hope for all America's wild horses, and why I keep fighting for them. You can find photos of them on my Wild Hoofbeats website with the link to this podcast, and you can get updates and blog posts on my website as well at www.wildhoofbeats.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.